The fluorescent lights in Huntsville State Prison's death row cast harsh shadows across concrete walls. But Colt Ravencrest had stopped noticing the institutional bleakness years ago. At 34, he'd spent 8 years in a 6x9 cell, counting down days until Texas would claim its final payment for the crime that had destroyed his life and shattered his soul. 3 weeks. That's all that remained between Colt and the lethal injection chamber, and he'd made peace with his fate long ago. The murder of oil executive Bronson Silverstone had been front-page news across Texas. A violent robbery gone wrong that left a wealthy businessman dead and a struggling rancher facing the ultimate penalty. Warden Dakota Ironfield had seen hundreds of condemned men in his 20-year career, but something about Colt Ravencrest had always troubled him. Unlike most death row inmates who proclaimed innocence until their final breath, Colt had accepted his conviction with quiet resignation, never appealing his sentence, never fighting the inevitable. "Ravencrest!" Warden Ironfield called through the cell bars during his routine morning rounds. "Your lawyer's here about final arrangements." Sage Brightwater, Colt's court-appointed attorney, looked exhausted as she settled into the visiting room's uncomfortable plastic chair. At 42, she'd represented dozens of capital cases, but Colt's had haunted her for reasons she'd never fully understood. Despite overwhelming evidence against him, something about his story had never felt complete. "Colt, we need to discuss your final requests," Sage said, consulting her legal pad. "The state allows last meal preferences, spiritual counseling, final statements." "I don't want any of that," Colt replied quietly, his voice carrying the flat, emotionless tone that had characterized their conversations for 8 years. "But there is one thing." "What's that?" Colt was silent for a long moment, staring at his hands with the same distant expression Sage had learned meant he was remembering something painful. "I want to see Thunder Ridge one more time. My bull. He's still at the old Ravencrest Ranch, or what's left of it." Sage felt her heart sink. Final visits to family were sometimes arranged, but a condemned man's last wish to see livestock was unprecedented. "Colt, you know that's not possible. Security protocols, transportation risks." "I know," Colt said simply, "but it's the only thing I've wanted for 8 years. That afternoon, Sage found herself doing something she'd never done in her legal career, researching whether Texas Department of Criminal Justice had ever granted such an unusual request. The precedents were virtually non-existent, but something about Colt's quiet desperation compelled her to try. The Ravencrest Ranch had been abandoned since Colt's arrest, the 800-acre spread falling into foreclosure when legal fees and court costs consumed the family's assets. But according to county records, Thunder Ridge, a massive black Angus bull, still roamed the property under the care of neighboring ranchers who'd maintained minimal upkeep out of respect for Colt's deceased father. "Why this bull?" Sage asked during her next visit. "Of all the final requests you could make, why Thunder Ridge?" Colt's expression softened for the first time in years, and Sage caught a glimpse of the man he'd been before tragedy reshaped his life. "My father died when I was 16. Left me the ranch and Thunder Ridge, who was just a calf then. For 18 years, that bull was the only family I had left. The only thing that understood me." "Understood you how?" "People always said I was strange, different. But Thunder Ridge never judged me for being quiet, for preferring animals to people, for seeing things others missed. When the ranch started failing and creditors were circling, when I felt like the world was crushing me, Thunder Ridge was there." Sage saw tears forming in Colt's eyes, the first emotion she'd witnessed from him in 8 years of legal proceedings. "The night everything went wrong, the night Bronson Silverstone died, I was supposed to meet Thunder Ridge for our evening walk. We had this routine, every day at sunset, but I never made it back to the ranch that night. Never got to explain to him why I disappeared." "Colt, he's an animal. He couldn't understand." "You're wrong," Colt interrupted with quiet intensity. "Thunder Ridge understood everything. Bulls that intelligent, they form bonds deeper than most humans comprehend. For 8 years I've wondered if he's still waiting for me to come home." That evening, Sage made a phone call that would set in motion events nobody could have predicted. She contacted Warden Ironfield with a request that tested the boundaries of compassion within a system designed for punishment. "Dakota, I know this sounds impossible, but I'm formally requesting permission for Colt Ravencrest to visit his bull before execution. I've never asked for anything like this, but there's something about this case. Sage, you know I can't authorize transport of a death row inmate to a private ranch. The security risks alone. What if we brought the bull to him? The silence on the other end stretched for nearly a minute. You want to transport a 2,000-pound bull to a maximum security prison? Just to the visitor's yard, under full security. Dakota, this man has accepted his fate without complaint for 8 years. He's never caused trouble, never fought his sentence. If we're going to take his life, can't we grant him this one moment of peace? Warden Ironfield had seen enough executions to understand that final wishes often revealed truths that courtrooms missed. Against every protocol he'd ever followed, he found himself considering the impossible. I'll make some calls, he said finally. But Sage, if this happens, it'll be the strangest thing I've ever authorized in 20 years of corrections work. As Sage hung up the phone, she wondered if she was fighting for a guilty man's comfort or an innocent man's redemption. Either way, she sensed that bringing Thunder Ridge to Huntsville State Prison would reveal something important about Colt Ravencrest, something that 8 years of legal proceedings had failed to uncover. The countdown to execution continued, but now it carried the weight of one man's desperate hope to say goodbye to the only family he'd ever known. What happened when they met again would challenge everything everyone thought they knew about guilt, innocence, and the bonds that define what it means to be human. The phone call that would change everything came at 6 a.m. on a Tuesday morning, jolting Sage Brightwater from the first peaceful sleep she'd had in weeks. Warden Dakota Ironfield's voice carried a mixture of disbelief and administrative exhaustion that suggested he'd been working through the night on something unprecedented. Sage, I've got news about Colt's request. You might want to sit down for this. What did the department say? After 14 hours of calls between Austin, Huntsville, and Washington, I've got provisional approval. But Sage, the conditions are extensive. What followed was a logistical nightmare that would require coordination between Texas Department of Criminal Justice, the governor's office, local sheriff's departments, and agricultural transport specialists. The security protocols alone filled 17 pages of documentation that read more like a military operation than a compassionate gesture. The transport window is 4 hours maximum, Warden Ironfield explained, his voice heavy with the weight of bureaucratic complexity. Full tactical team escort, closed-circuit monitoring, and the moment anything goes wrong, the whole operation shuts down. They're treating this like a state visit for security purposes. Sage felt a rush of emotions she couldn't quite name. Relief, anxiety, hope, and terror all competing for dominance in her chest. And Colt? Doesn't know yet. I wanted to make sure everything was confirmed before raising his hopes. We've got exactly 72 hours to coordinate this, assuming weather and logistics cooperate. The next challenge was locating Thunder Ridge and arranging his transportation from the abandoned Ravencrest Ranch. The property had been empty for 8 years, but neighboring rancher Sterling Goldmeadow had maintained minimal care for the bull out of respect for Colt's deceased father and a stubborn belief in his innocence. That bull's been waiting, Sterling told Sage when she called to explain the situation, his weathered voice carrying the weight of 8 years of observation. Sounds crazy, but for 8 years, Thunder Ridge has positioned himself near the ranch gate every evening around sunset, like he's watching for someone who never comes home. What do you mean, waiting? Bulls don't typically show that kind of loyalty, I guess you'd call it. But Thunder Ridge ain't typical. He's smart, real smart. Sometimes I catch him staring down the road toward town like he knows something the rest of us don't. Been doing it every day since Colt was arrested. Dr. River Clearwater, the region's most experienced large animal veterinarian, was brought in to evaluate Thunder Ridge's condition for transport. At 48, she'd handled livestock logistics for county fairs, rodeos, and breeding operations across 3 states, but never for a death row visit. Physically, he's in remarkable condition for a 12-year-old bull, Dr. Clearwater reported after her comprehensive examination. But there's something unusual about his behavior patterns. He shows signs of prolonged stress, not from poor care, but from what appears to be separation anxiety. Separation anxiety in a bull? I know how it sounds. But bulls this intelligent can form emotional attachments that persist for years. If Thunder Ridge bonded strongly with Colt Ravencrest, 8 years of abandonment could have created psychological trauma that manifests as chronic vigilance and behavioral fixation. The media attention was immediate and intense. News of Texas's unprecedented decision to grant a death row inmate's request to see his bull spread across national outlets within hours. Cable news programs debated whether compassionate gestures toward condemned criminals sent the wrong message about justice and accountability. "This is ridiculous," declared prosecutor Maxwell Ironstone during a CNN interview, his face flushed with indignation. "Colt Ravencrest murdered an innocent man in cold blood. The state shouldn't be wasting taxpayer resources on sentimental animal visits that serve no purpose except to humanize a killer." But public opinion was surprisingly divided. Social media filled with debates about humanity, redemption, and whether even guilty men deserved final moments of peace. Animal welfare organizations rallied behind the story, while victims' rights groups expressed outrage at what they saw as misplaced sympathy. Colt learned about the approved visit when Warden Ironfield personally delivered the news during evening rounds. For the first time in 8 years, guards witnessed genuine emotion from the man who'd accepted his death sentence without complaint or appeal. "He's really coming?" Colt asked, his voice breaking with disbelief and hope. "Thunder Ridge is really coming here?" "Day after tomorrow, 2 p.m. You'll have 30 minutes in the secured visitor's yard under full supervision." "Colt, I need you to understand. This is unprecedented. Any problems, any security concerns, and it ends immediately." That night, guards reported hearing Colt pacing his cell for the first time since his incarceration began, occasionally speaking softly to himself in what sounded like practice conversations. For years, he'd been the quietest inmate on death row, but now he seemed to be preparing for the most important meeting of his life. IDOT. Clearwater supervised Thunder Ridge's loading into the specialized transport trailer early Thursday morning. The bull's behavior during preparation was unlike anything she'd documented in 2 decades of veterinary practice. Instead of the typical resistance livestock showed to unfamiliar transport, Thunder Ridge seemed almost eager, as if he understood the significance of the journey ahead. "It's like he knows where he's going," observed transport specialist Canyon Riverside, a man who'd hauled everything from prize stallions to circus elephants. "Never seen a bull that calmed during loading for an unknown destination. Usually they're nervous, agitated. This one's purposeful." The convoy that departed for Huntsville State Prison looked more like a presidential motorcade than livestock transport. Police escorts, unmarked security vehicles, and tactical personnel who'd been briefed on protocols that had never been tested before in American corrections history. Inside his cell, Colt stood at the small window that faced the visitors area, watching for the first glimpse of the only family he'd ever truly known. 3 hours until they would meet again. 3 hours until whatever truth had been buried for 8 years finally had its chance to surface. Prison chaplain Aurora Whitehorse, who'd counseled hundreds of condemned men through their final days, had never seen anticipation like Colt's. "In 20 years of death row ministry, I've never witnessed hope this pure in someone so close to execution. Whatever happens this afternoon, it's going to matter in ways none of us can predict." As the transport convoy approached Huntsville's gates, carrying a bull who'd waited 8 years for this reunion, everyone involved sensed they were about to witness something unprecedented in the history of American justice. The secured visitors' yard at Huntsville State Prison had been transformed into something unprecedented in Texas correctional history. Tactical officers positioned at every corner, veterinary equipment standing ready, and media helicopters circling overhead like mechanical vultures waiting to capture whatever historic moment was about to unfold between a condemned man and the bull who'd been his only family. Dr. River Clearwater supervised Thunder Ridge's unloading from the transport trailer, her trained eye noting behavioral details that would later prove crucial to understanding what happened next. The massive bull emerged with surprising calm, his intelligent dark eyes immediately scanning the unfamiliar concrete environment with what appeared to be purposeful assessment rather than fear or confusion. "He's looking for something specific, Dr. 8, Clearwater murmured to Warden Ironfield, who stood watching with the tense alertness of someone responsible for security in an impossible situation. "This isn't typical livestock behavior in a stressful environment. He's searching." Inside the prison, Colt Ravencrest was escorted through multiple security checkpoints by guards who'd witnessed his transformation over the past 2 days. The man who'd been a model of stoic resignation for 8 years now moved with barely contained energy, his eyes bright with anticipation that seemed to radiate from his entire being. 30 minutes, Ravencrest, announced Captain Ridge Stoneheart, the tactical team leader overseeing security for the unprecedented visit. Any sudden movements, any breach of protocol, and this ends immediately. We're bending every rule in the book for this. Colt nodded, his attention already focused on the steel door that separated him from Thunder Ridge. I understand. Thank you for making this possible. The moment when that door opened would be replayed on news programs across the country for weeks afterward. Colt stepped into the visitor's yard, wearing the standard orange jumpsuit and restraints, but his expression carried an emotional intensity that made everyone present forget, momentarily, that they were watching a convicted murderer approach his final wish. Thunder Ridge's reaction was immediate and profound. The bull, who'd been calmly standing near the transport trailer, suddenly lifted his massive head and fixed his gaze on Colt with laser focus. For several seconds that stretched like eternity, neither man nor animal moved, as if both were processing the reality of a reunion neither had dared hope would happen. Then Thunder Ridge began moving toward Colt, with deliberate, measured steps that spoke of recognition so deep it transcended species boundaries. The tactical officers tensed, hands moving instinctively toward their weapons, but Dr. Clearwater raised a warning hand. "Don't interfere," she said quietly, her veterinary instincts recognizing something extraordinary unfolding. This is what we came to witness. When Thunder Ridge reached the chain-link barrier that separated them for security purposes, he stopped and lowered his enormous head until it was level with Colt's chest. The gesture was so gentle, so filled with what could only be described as love and recognition, that several hardened prison guards found themselves unexpectedly moved by the scene. "Hello, old friend," Colt whispered, his voice thick with 8 years of suppressed grief and longing. "I'm so sorry I never came home." Thunder Ridge's response was a soft rumble that seemed to carry every emotion neither of them had been able to express during their long separation. The bull pressed his forehead against the fence as close to Colt as the barriers would allow, and Colt reached through the chain link to stroke the familiar black coat he'd known since childhood. "Look at his eyes," Sage Brightwater whispered to Warden Ironfield, who'd positioned himself where he could observe both inmate and animal. "That bull recognizes him completely. This isn't just familiarity, it's genuine love." But it was what happened next that would haunt everyone present for the rest of their lives. As Colt continued speaking to Thunder Ridge in the low conversational tone that had apparently been their private language, the bull began exhibiting behavior that defied everything the security team thought they understood about livestock intelligence. Thunder Ridge started pawing the ground in deliberate patterns, creating shapes in the dirt that looked almost like symbols. Circles, lines, and marks that seemed intentional rather than random, as if the bull was trying to communicate something specific and urgent. "Is he trying to tell us something?" asked Chaplain Aurora Whitehorse, who'd witnessed countless final meetings but never anything remotely like this display of apparent interspecies communication. Colt's reaction to Thunder Ridge's ground pawing was electric. His entire posture changed as he studied the patterns the bull was creating, his face cycling through confusion, recognition, and finally, a kind of desperate hope that made him look younger than he had in years. "You remember," Colt said wonderingly, his voice gaining strength and clarity for the first time since his arrest. "After all this time, you remember our game." "What game?" Warden Ironfield demanded, his security instincts alerting him that something significant was happening beyond his understanding or control. "Thunder Ridge he's telling me about that night," Colt said, his voice gaining strength and urgency. "The night Bronson Silverstone died. He was there. He saw everything." The visitor's yard fell silent except for the distant sound of helicopters and the soft rumble of Thunder Ridge's continued communication with Colt. Everyone present sensed they were witnessing something that transcended their expectations of what this meeting would accomplish. Dr. Clearwater began documenting Thunder Ridge's behavior with professional fascination mixed with growing amazement. "The patterns he's creating are consistent and deliberate. If Mr. Ravencrest is correct about some form of communication system they developed, this bull may be attempting to convey specific information about past events." "Information about what?" Captain Stoneheart asked. though his tactical training was telling him they'd moved far beyond simple security concerns into territory none of them were prepared to handle. Colt looked up from studying Thunder Ridge's ground symbols, and for the first time in 8 years, his face carried something other than resignation. It carried hope mixed with the kind of desperate urgency that comes from running out of time. "Thunder Ridge is telling me who really killed Bronson Silverstone," Colt said, his voice steady despite the magnitude of what he was claiming. "And if I'm reading these symbols correctly, the real killer is someone who's been free for 8 years while I've been waiting to die for a crime I didn't commit." The 30-minute visit that was supposed to provide closure for a condemned man had just become something unprecedented in American criminal justice. A potential revelation of innocence delivered by a bull who'd waited 8 years to tell his side of the story. The emergency meeting in Warden Ironfield's office began at 6 p.m. that same day, with participants who'd never imagined they'd be evaluating testimony from a bull as potential evidence in a capital murder case. Sage Brightwater sat across from District Attorney Phoenix Blackwater, while Dr. River Clearwater consulted her detailed notes about Thunder Ridge's behavioral patterns, and Captain Ridge Stoneheart reviewed security footage from the unprecedented prison visit. "Let me understand this correctly," D.A. Blackwater said, her voice tight with professional skepticism and barely concealed frustration. "You're claiming that a bull witnessed the Silverstone murder and has been waiting 8 years to communicate what he saw through dirt patterns?" "I know how it sounds," Sage replied, her legal instincts warring with what she'd witnessed in the visitor's yard. But Thunder Ridge's behavior was unlike anything Dr. Clearwater has documented in large animals. The patterns were deliberate, consistent, and Colt's interpretation was immediate and specific. Colt had been returned to his cell under heightened security while officials decided how to handle his explosive claims. His 30 minutes with Thunder Ridge had transformed him from resigned, condemned man to someone fighting desperately for his life with renewed purpose and unshakable conviction. According to Ravencrest's interpretation, Warden Ironfield consulted his notes with the careful precision of someone documenting the impossible. Thunder Ridge indicated that 2 people were at the ranch that night, not 1. The bull's patterns suggested someone else was present during the attack on Silverstone. Dr. Clearwater leaned forward, her scientific training compelling her to support what she'd observed despite its unprecedented nature. "I've worked with cattle intelligence for 15 years, and I've never seen behavior like Thunder Ridge displayed today. The deliberate nature of his ground pawing, the way he responded to Colt's questions with specific pattern variations, it suggests cognitive abilities far beyond normal bovine intelligence." "But it's not admissible evidence," D.A. Blackwater stated firmly, her prosecutor's instincts rejecting anything that challenged the conviction she'd helped secure. "No court in America would accept testimony from a bull, regardless of how intelligent the animal might be." That's when Sage produced the document that would change everything. A thick folder of crime scene photos and evidence reports she'd been reviewing obsessively for 8 years, looking for the overlooked detail that might save her client's life. "Actually, Phoenix, there's precedent for animal testimony in unusual circumstances. And more importantly, if Thunder Ridge really did witness the murder, there might be physical evidence we overlooked 8 years ago." She spread out copies of crime scene photos across the conference table, images that had convicted Colt, but might now tell a different story. "Look at these shots of the ranch property. The original investigation focused on the barn where Silverstone's body was found, but these aerial photos show significant ground disturbance in the main pasture, exactly where Thunder Ridge would have been that evening." Dr. Clearwater studied the photos with growing excitement, her veterinary expertise allowing her to see patterns that law enforcement had missed. If Thunder Ridge witnessed an attack, his behavioral patterns would have created specific ground markings. Bulls under extreme stress exhibit territorial and protective behaviors that leave distinctive evidence. "What kind of evidence?" Warden Ironfield asked, his 20 years of corrections experience telling him they were dealing with something that could revolutionize how criminal cases were investigated. "Hoof prints, but more importantly, stress patterns in the dirt that indicate the animal's emotional state and movement patterns." If Thunder Ridge saw violence, his immediate response would have been to position himself defensively while maintaining visual contact with the threat. Those behavioral responses create forensic signatures that can be read years later with the right expertise. Over the next 48 hours, What began as a condemned man's last wish evolved into the most unusual criminal investigation in Texas history. A forensic team returned to the abandoned Ravencrest ranch with ground-penetrating radar, soil analysis equipment, and Dr. Clearwater's expertise in reading animal behavioral evidence that had been invisible to conventional investigation techniques. What they discovered in the main pasture would vindicate both Colt and Thunder Ridge in ways no one had anticipated. "The soil analysis confirms it," announced forensic specialist River Goldstone after 2 days of intensive investigation. "The ground disturbance patterns indicate a large animal, consistent with Thunder Ridge's size and weight, remained in defensive positioning for an extended period 8 years ago. More importantly, we found evidence of a second vehicle that was never accounted for in the original investigation. Tire tracks, partially obscured by years of weather but still detectable with advanced forensic techniques, told a story that the original investigation had missed completely. Someone else had been at the Ravencrest ranch the night Bronson Silverstone died, someone whose presence had never been documented or investigated. The breakthrough came when investigators matched the tire patterns to a vehicle registered to Viper Ironstone, Maxwell Ironstone's brother and a business associate of Silverstone, who'd provided an alibi for Maxwell during the original trial, but whose own whereabouts that night had never been thoroughly investigated. "We've been investigating the wrong suspect for 8 years, DA Blackwater admitted during a press conference that made national headlines and sent shockwaves through the criminal justice system. New evidence suggests that Colt Ravencrest may be innocent and that the real perpetrator has been living free while an innocent man waited on death row. But the most remarkable development was Thunder Ridge's continued cooperation with investigators. When brought back to the ranch property, the bull immediately moved to specific locations where additional evidence was discovered: blood traces that had been missed, fabric fibers caught on fence posts, and ultimately, a weapon that had been buried in a location only someone who witnessed the crime could have known about. "It's unprecedented," Dr. Clearwater explained to stunned news reporters gathered at the ranch. Thunder Ridge's intelligence and emotional attachment to Colt compelled him to preserve evidence in the only way he could, by maintaining behavioral patterns that marked significant locations on the property. The arrest of Viper Ironstone came exactly 1 week before Colt's scheduled execution. Security footage from 8 years ago, re-examined with new investigative focus, showed Viper's vehicle in the area during the time frame of Silverstone's death, contradicting the alibi that had kept him clear of suspicion. "I never meant to kill anyone," Viper confessed after 18 hours of interrogation, his composure finally cracking under the weight of evidence that a bull had helped preserve. "Silverstone was blackmailing my brother over some shady business deals. I just meant to scare him, maybe rough him up a little, but things got out of hand." As news of Colt's impending exoneration spread across the country, the story of Thunder Ridge's 8-year vigil became a symbol of loyalty, intelligence, and the power of bonds that transcend species. The bull who'd waited every evening at the ranch gate hadn't just been mourning his missing human. He'd been guarding the truth until someone was finally ready to listen. The media circus surrounding Huntsville State Prison on Monday morning resembled a presidential release rather than a death row exoneration. News vans lined the perimeter road, reporters jockeyed for position, and helicopters circled overhead as the most unusual wrongful conviction case in American legal history reached its conclusion. Inside the prison, Colt Ravencrest stood in the same cell he'd occupied for 8 years, but everything about him had changed. The resigned stoicism that had defined his incarceration had been replaced by an energy that guards described as coming back to life. For the first time since his arrest, he had a future to plan, dreams to rebuild, and a reunion that had been 8 years in the making. "Your paperwork's complete," Sage Brightwater announced as she entered the visiting room where Colt waited for his final processing. "All charges dropped, full exoneration, and the state's preparing a substantial compensation package for wrongful imprisonment. You're a free man, Colt." Colt nodded, but his attention was focused on the window that faced the parking lot, where a familiar livestock trailer waited. "Is he here?" Thunder Ridge arrived an hour ago. Sterling Goldmeadow brought him personally, along with half the county who wanted to witness this moment. What had begun as a death row inmate's final wish had evolved into a celebration that attracted supporters from across Texas and beyond. Ranchers, animal rights activists, legal professionals, and curious citizens had gathered to witness the reunion that had exposed one of the most significant wrongful convictions in state history. Warden Dakota Ironfield personally escorted Colt through the prison's final checkpoint, a ritual that usually ended at the execution chamber, but today led to unprecedented freedom. In 24 years of corrections work, he told Colt as they walked through corridors that had been his world for nearly a decade, I've never been happier to see someone leave this place. The moment when the prison doors opened was captured by dozens of cameras, but the footage showed something remarkable. Instead of the typical exuberant joy of a freed prisoner, Colt's eyes immediately searched the crowd until they found Thunder Ridge standing calmly beside the trailer, as if the bull had been waiting patiently for this exact moment. He knew you were coming, Sterling Goldmeadow observed as Colt approached the trailer with measured steps. Been standing like that since we arrived, just watching the prison entrance like he understood exactly what was happening. Thunder Ridge's reaction to seeing Colt in civilian clothes rather than prison orange was immediate and profound. The bull's entire posture changed from patient waiting to active engagement, his intelligent eyes tracking every movement as Colt walked across the parking lot toward him, free for the first time in 8 years. Hello, old friend, Colt said softly, the same words he'd spoken through the chain-link fence a week earlier, but now carrying the weight of vindication and the promise of reunion. Ready to go home? Thunder Ridge's response was the soft rumble that had become their private language, but this time it carried none of the grief that had marked their prison visit. This was the sound of completion, of a promise finally being kept after years of faithful waiting. The convoy that left Huntsville State Prison looked nothing like the security-heavy transport that had brought Thunder Ridge a week earlier. Instead of tactical officers and unmarked vehicles, a celebration parade followed Colt and Thunder Ridge back to Ravencrest Ranch, with supporters honking horns and waving signs that read, Justice for Colt and Thunder Ridge Hero Bull. The ranch that Colt returned to bore little resemblance to the property he'd been forced to abandon 8 years earlier. Neighboring ranchers had quietly maintained the essential infrastructure, and in the past week, volunteers had worked around the clock to restore the main house and barn to livable condition. Community took care of what they could, Sterling explained, as they pulled into the familiar gravel driveway that led home. Wasn't right letting the place fall apart while you were locked up for something you didn't do. We always believed in your innocence even when the evidence seemed overwhelming, but it was the condition of the main pasture that moved Colt to tears. The grass had been maintained, water troughs kept full, and most remarkably, a clear path had been worn in the earth. The exact route of the evening walks that Colt and Thunder Ridge had taken together for years, before that terrible night changed everything. He's been walking it, Sterling said quietly, understanding the emotional significance of what Colt was seeing. Every evening at sunset, Thunder Ridge would patrol that same path you two used to take together, like he was keeping your routine alive until you came back. That evening, as the media attention died down and supporters gradually departed, Colt and Thunder Ridge finally had their first moment alone together in 8 years. The sun was setting over the Texas plains, painting the sky in the familiar oranges and purples that had marked the end of countless days before tragedy separated them. I'm sorry I left you, Colt said as they began walking the familiar path through the pasture, his hand resting on Thunder Ridge's massive neck. I know you waited, and I know you tried to tell them the truth. I should have trusted that someone would eventually listen. Thunder Ridge's response was to move closer to Colt's side, close enough that the man could feel the warmth and strength of the animal who'd preserved his innocence through 8 years of faithful vigil. It was a gesture of forgiveness and reunion that spoke louder than any words could have managed. As they completed their sunset walk, returning to the barn where Thunder Ridge would spend his first night in years with his human nearby, Colt realized that their ordeal had changed him in ways he was only beginning to understand. The shy, quiet rancher who'd preferred animals to people had been replaced by someone who understood the value of speaking up, of fighting for truth, of accepting help from a community that had rallied around his innocence. Thank you, he whispered to Thunder Ridge as the bull settled contentedly in his familiar stall. You saved my life in every way that matters. Thunder Ridge's final response of the evening was the soft rumble that meant contentment, safety, and home. After 8 years of waiting, keeping watch, and preserving the truth until someone was ready to hear it, the most loyal friend in Texas could finally rest. 1 year after Colt Ravencrest walked free from death row, the story of Thunder Ridge had transformed into a global symbol of loyalty and justice. Ravencrest Ranch had become an unlikely destination, attracting visitors worldwide who came to meet the bull, whose testimony saved an innocent man's life. Colt stood in the main pasture on a crisp October morning, watching Thunder Ridge demonstrate for animal behaviorists the communication system that had exposed the real killer. At 35, Colt looked like a man given a second chance. Healthier, confident, at peace with the attention their story generated. The ranch had evolved into something unprecedented. Part working cattle operation, part research facility, part sanctuary for those failed by the justice system. Colt partnered with universities studying animal intelligence, while providing retreat space for other exonerees struggling to rebuild lives after wrongful imprisonment. The silence was hardest, explained Marcus Goldstream, former death row inmate exonerated after 12 years. Nobody understands knowing you're innocent while the world believes you're guilty. Here, with Colt and Thunder Ridge, you realize truth has its own timeline. Legal impact continued reverberating through criminal justice systems. The Thunder Ridge Protocol required crime scene teams to consider animal behavioral evidence when examining rural scenes. 3 additional wrongful convictions had been overturned using techniques developed from Thunder Ridge's testimony. Perhaps the most remarkable transformation was in Colt himself. The shy, isolated rancher who'd preferred animals to people had become an unlikely spokesperson for wrongful conviction reform. Thunder Ridge didn't just save my life, Colt told a packed law school auditorium. He taught me that being different, seeing things others miss, these aren't weaknesses. They're gifts that can change everything when given the chance. As the anniversary of his release approached, Colt received a letter that closed the final chapter of his ordeal. Viper Ironstone, serving life without parole, had written from prison with an apology carrying 8 years of injustice's weight. Seeing you walk free with that bull, seeing how he waited for you, made me understand what I really took from you, Viper wrote. Thunder Ridge's loyalty is why I finally told the truth. Even animals understand honor better than I did. That evening, as Colt and Thunder Ridge took their daily sunset walk through the pasture where truth had been preserved in hoofprint patterns, both seemed to understand their story had become larger than individual experience. You know the best part? Colt said, pausing at the spot where Thunder Ridge first demonstrated his testimony. People used to think I was strange for preferring your company to most humans. Now they understand you're better company than most humans deserve. Thunder Ridge's response was the soft rumble meaning contentment, but also something deeper. Satisfaction of a promise kept, vigil ended, loyalty vindicated. The ranch now hosted annual symposiums on wrongful convictions and animal intelligence, bringing together legal experts, veterinarians, and formerly incarcerated individuals. The event had become Thunder Ridge Day, celebrating second chances and never giving up hope. We receive letters from around the world, explained Sage Brightwater, now directing the Thunder Ridge Foundation. People facing impossible situations, fighting for unreachable justice. Colt and Thunder Ridge represent universal belief that truth will surface, loyalty is never wasted. Walking back toward the barn and gathering twilight, Colt realized their ordeal had given them something precious beyond vindication. Absolute proof that love transcends species. Truth survives even when buried. And sometimes the most important testimony comes from those who can't speak but refuse to forget. The bull who'd waited 8 years to tell his story and the man who'd almost died for a crime he didn't commit had become living proof that justice, however delayed, could still find its way home. Their story would inspire legislation, change procedures, and spark debates about loyalty itself. But their greatest victory was simpler. They were together again, their bond proven stronger than injustice, separation, and even death's threat. A story of loyalty, justice, and unbreakable bonds proving that truth has its own timeline, and the most powerful testimony comes from those who love us enough to never give up hope. His last wish before execution was to see his bull at the ranch, but the moment stunned everyone.